Noirette or Hello, you have reached today's episode of Legally Noirette or Legally Ravenhead, and today we are reading this book called Hereof, Thereof, and Everywhereof, A Contrarian Guide to Legal Drafting, second edition, Howard Darmstadter. I don't know much about Howard, but I would like to. This is for my family, Patricia, David, and Michael. Yes, I don't know, but it's really good, and I like the way it's written. I like the size of the print here, So I am reading this book because it is. I'm gonna write a review of it for the Vermont ABA Association. Or the Vermont Bar Association. I'm sorry, ABA is a weird thing. So anyway, I just want to read it on video so that I can listen to it again. All right, so here we go. So I'm actually going to start at the end of the book because I am preparing a DIY legal document class on how to become a legal service provider. And this is talking about modern times on the assembly line. So I think it has to do with that. So I'm going to read that. So we're going to read the last chapter or close to the last chapter first. How about that? Okay. Modern times on the assembly line. Let me check my time. Okay. In the popular and perhaps even legal imagination, there is a legal bond street where highly trained lawyers painstakingly construct documents to the highest legal standards. I have no doubt that for high dollar unique transactions, this bespoke trade really exists. But for the majority of legal documents, it's pret-a-porter. Documents are constructed from a form file at high speed with an emphasis on standardization and low cost. Legal mass production goes back at least to the standardized print form, such as those used in many areas for apartment leases. But lately, developments in business practices and technology and advances in high-speed communications have resulted in increased demand for rapid and efficient production. Running with the email monster. A few years ago, I was involved in a project to amend 60 credit agreements and issue 60 new parent company guarantees to the various lenders. The documents weren't difficult, but the project had to be done speed of light. And it was thanks to two modern marvels, computerized document production, and email. Neither of these advances were new to me, but on this project, both were used with an intensity that went beyond anything I had ever seen before. While the experience was novel, it seemed obvious that this could be the shape of law to come. Time was 15 years ago. Each part of a drafting project had an inflexible deadline. The documents had to be at the FedEx office by 8 p.m. The deadline was draconian, a minute late, and you would lose the whole day. But it often provided two kinds of comfort. First, there was no point in getting the document to FedEx much before the deadline. So if you were running ahead of schedule, you had the leisure to fuss over your document. Second, once the document went out the door Tuesday evening, you knew you wouldn't see them again before Thursday morning, leaving you all of Wednesday to regroup, rethink, and rejoice. Then along came fax. Now you could send out documents at any time of day, but the fax machines were slow and there was often a line of people waiting to use them. So there was a reluctance to send out long documents by fax to anything short of a full emergency. Say hello to email and buy a cot for the office. Now, with a touch of a button, any document can instantly be sent any place in the world. But if you're sending the documents to Europe, you have to get them out by lunchtime before the Euro folks have left for the day. For Asia, you can send the documents as late as you want, but while you sleep, the documents will be worked on, returning as an unwelcome email when you power up the next morning. In many transactions, there may be no downtime in the drafting process. With these new time pressures, documents are likely to get pretty sloppy, at least by the standards of the hyper fastidious recent past. Since every additional minute spent on a document means it gets to the recipient 1 minute later, there are pressures to forego the usual legal fly specking. Parts of this problem may have technological fixes, hell, spell check, but not all. In the future, documents are likely to be fast and funky. I like that. The second engine propelling us toward a rapid fire future is computerized document production, specifically the merge feature in word processing programs. For example, you can create your annual Christmas letter to your friends and relations in a single standard form and then merge it with a second data document containing 125 address and produce 125 semi-personal letters. These days, even Christmas needs a productivity boost. The same magic works for legal documents. My 60 credit agreements, for example, had different lenders, borrowers, and commitments, section numbering, governing laws, and other messy singularities. I really need to know what a credit agreement is. Luckily, only 2 covenants had to be amended, though not every agreement had both. We created a single document and half a dozen lightly different forms to produce the 60 amendments and guarantees. For a lawyer, not having enough time is like not having enough money. It can be unpleasant, but also refreshing. You have to ask yourself what is essential, what merely useful, and what entirely frivolous. Had we but world enough and time, we could have arranged the merges to take account for every variation in the credit agreements. As it was, we did a rough cut and sent the draft documents out. Here, rough meant we did one quick internal review and launched. Our mistakes were there for all the world to see. The lenders pointed them out, and we tried not to act embarrassed. The lenders pointed them out, and we tried not to act embarrassed. That was funny. We amended covenants. We amended covenants that didn't exist. That is, every amendment dealt with both objectionable covenants, even if the particular credit agreement only had one. The critical sections of the amendment thus began to the extent that the credit agreement requires that blank, blank, blank. Some lenders mark the sections as not applicable, but relented when we explained. We specified sections by title rather than number. The amendment thus referred to the section titled Covenants or Representation, Warranties, and Covenants. New sections were stated to be inserted at the end of the covenant section, appropriately numbered. As lenders came back with comments, we rejected every change that wasn't absolutely necessary. Dealing with so many amendments and lenders and moving so fast, we wanted the second drafts to be as close to the first as possible. For example, we had inserted a notice address for the guarantor in the amendment, even though the guarantor wasn't a party to the amendment. It was a mistake, but since it did no harm, it stayed. At this point, you may want to object that the obvious solution to our problem, if such it was, is to use more people rather than having one person, me, responsible for 60 amendments and guarantees. We can have 60 associates, each responsible for one amendment or guarantee combination, or 6 associates responsible for 10 amendments and guarantees, or another combination that fits the available personnel resources and requirements for the project. It might cost more money, but it would ensure that each amendment and guarantee exactly match the requirements without extra inapplicable clauses or other workarounds. Well, that that it might cost more money is not a trivial concern out here in the real world, and it might cost more money than you think. Consider all those amendments and guarantees, whatever their required differences, will also need to be substantially the same as they are all parts of a single business objective. This means that the actions of our 60 or 6 associates have to be coordinated. Team meetings, documents shuffle back and forth for comparison, reports up the line, the whole panoply. I need to find out that word of tasks needed to get separate lawyers to work as a team. With merge, you don't have that problem. A single lawyer does it all, and the only team communication is between hemispheres of a single brain. Back to the adventures of our one-man law firm. My modern ruthlessness also extended to the junk documents, the numerous opinions and certificates that clutter every closing. In particular, I skinny down the secretary's certificates. A secretary certificate attempts to trace through a succession of documents the authority of the corporation to enter into the transaction and of its designated officers to bind the corporation. A typical certificate will thus state that up-to-date copies of the company's certificate and bylaws are attached, as well as resolutions of the board of directors stating which corporate officers can bind the company to the transaction. Finally, the certificate or a separate incumbency certificate will name the current occupants of those offices and provide specimen signatures of the officers that the other parties can compare to the signatures on the substantive documents. In many closings, one party leaves the room with a pile of money and the other with a stack of paper promises. My own style has been to give the paper party whatever extra document it wants, as lavishly sealed and be ribboned as may give it comfort. But here we decline to attach copies of the certificate of incorporation or the bylaws to the certificates. In mid-rush, we weren't salivating at the thought of assembling, copying, and collating thousands of pages of additional documents. In any case, the guarantor was a public company and the documents could be gleaned from its SEC filings. Not that many lenders bothered. Board resolutions were another story. Some boards give their officers wide latitude, others confine them narrowly, so it's usually a good idea to look at the resolutions. And it was easy enough to add a single page of resolution to the certificate form, which brings us to the incumbency certificate, a minor document with major perplexities. For one thing, once you start to worry about the bona fides of the signers of the substantive documents, there seems nothing to stop you from worrying about the identity and authority of the signer of the incumbency certificate. Many incumbency certificates are just as fine by having a second signer certify as the first signer, like having Atlas stand on a tortoise. It settles nothing. I've heard of lawyers requesting a third certification, which was good for some lawyers. I've heard of lawyers requesting a third certification, which was good for some laughs. A friend once usually suggested that we forget about the incumbency certificate and instead have each signer produce a driver's license and 2 major credit cards. Also, many lawyers don't relish being amateur graphologists, asked to compare the specimen of signatures on the incumbency certificates with the signatures on the substantive document. Most of the incumbency certificates I prepare these days don't include specimen signatures. Instead, they simply recite the Petulia Power Luncher. They simply recite that Petulia Power Luncher is vice president of the company and signed the credit agreement as such. Such a certificate, besides being easier to prepare, is probably more useful to the recipient than the traditional form. Perhaps you don't envision ever being asked to cook up documents in batches of 60, but any standard document can be set up on a merge farm. The next time you use it, you can load another record into the data document and squeeze the trigger. Merge Blaster, a weapon of choice for the lightspeed lawyer. In praise of cookie cutters, transactions that are done repeatedly with only slight changes in the documents to reflect new players, days, dollars, amounts, and other ephemera, I need to look up this word, are often often disparaged as cookie cutters. Actually, it's the template for the document that is the cookie cutter, which makes the document a cookie, although I've never heard it called that. The expectation is that all cookies will be subjected to little proofreading and have no creative lawyering. The documents will be read, of course, but mainly to prevent the howlers that hands-off automated law. The documents will be read, of course, but mainly to prevent the howlers that hands-off automated law practice can create. I vividly remember a cookie for which the global replacement of bank by insurance company seemed to work well until we discovered a reference to the insurance the insurance company RUPC code. It's like instead of bankruptcy, insurance company RUPC code. Luckily, we fixed things before the document went to the client. Oh, bankruptcy code, and it changed it to insurance company code. Okay. The advantages of cookie cutters are the advantages of mass production generally: high speed, low cost, predictable features. It's comforting to pontificate that every document should be pored over by highly trained lawyers bent on absolute perfection. The truth, however, is that clients often prefer quick, cheap, and no surprises. I sing the advantages of cookie cutters, however, not to convince you, but to reconcile you. Like it or not, we live at the dawn of a cookie cutter era. It's been barely a decade since lawyers were expected to have computers on their desks and to do their own word processing. Soon we learn to search and replace and cut and paste, and eventually we discovered mail merge. At that point, the temptation to cut a cookie becomes irresistible. See the preceding section on running with running with the email monster. Cookie cutter technology can be a lot more sophisticated than global replacement and mail merge. I haven't used any of the document assembly programs that are available, but it shouldn't be too difficult to automate a document so that pre-written modules can be dropped in wherever the transaction has a special feature, but not otherwise. Alternatively, you can design a document with the expectation that it will be used as a cookie cutter template, which is the challenge that I've been wrestling with lately. As readers may have already surmised, a big part of my day job is drafting documents for residential mortgage securitizations. For the last 3 years, as interest rates have tumbled and mortgage refinancing booms, we've generally issued 2 series of mortgage-backed securities every month. The key documents for our mortgage securitization are the prospectus and the pooling and servicing agreement. Each of these is designed in 2 parts. The back part deals with features that are the same from series to series, while the front part describes the unique bits. A series consists of different classes of securities, each with its own principal amount, interest rate, expected maturity, and other features. In the past few years, we've had series as few as 7 and as many as 60 classes. Information about these classes is usually scattered through the front part of the document. The investment bankers continually dream up new class features, and a class with a new gimmick may have to be expected. Okay. The investment bankers continually dream up new class features, and a class with a new gimmick may have to be out of accepted out from certain parts of the discussion. For example, usually, one or more of the classes is a principal only or PO class. A PO class passes through principal payments on mortgages, but not interest payments. PO classes will be mentioned as exceptions at many places in the document where interest payments are discussed. But some series have no PO classes. So how do you design a cookie cutter for these types of transactions where there are thousands of possible combinations of features? Remember, we're trying to produce documents quickly while avoiding mistakes and minimizing proofing. One way to achieve this is to move some of the description of the special features of the classes to the back of the document. For example, the defining characteristics of a PO class can be described in unvarying language in the back. And only the particular features, the class designation and principal amount described in the front. The description of the PO class in the back will remain even for a series where there are no PO classes. This tends to make the document a bit longer, but paper is cheap. But you can't move everything to the back. The next step is to reword statements in the front, such as interest will be distributed to the classes other than class A4, a PO class. To interest will be distributed to the classes other than PO classes. Now, when the PO class for the next series is designated A5, we don't have to scour the prospectus to make the replacements. Of course, we identify the PO classes near the beginning of the document. But can we leave in the other than any PO class parenthetical, even in those series where there are no PO classes? A long time ago, in a lifetime far away, I taught symbolic logic. Early in the course, I had to explain to my students that statements in the form of if, then B were always considered true if A was false. This had never seemed problematic to me when I learned logic, and it seemed just as natural to many of my students. Other students, however, found this a difficult idea to swallow. My lawyers have a similar problem where there is a reference to any PO classes. They would be comfortable referring to any PO classes in the back of the documents, which might be used in some series where there are no PO classes and others where there are. In some series where there are PO classes and others where there are none. But in the front part of the particular series that lacks PO classes, references to any of PO classes seem, if not false, then at least misleading. Incidentally, my views on the logic of any means that I write any PO classes rather than PO classes, if any. I regard the latter as barbarism. My own preference is to leave the parenthetical in. If you're going to have a cookie cutter, then you're going to suffer some crumbs in the works. Most lawyers find this logic convincing for documents that are seldom most lawyers find this logic convincing for documents that are seldom read by investors, such as pooling and servicing agreement. For the prospectus, however, some lawyers worry that the extra parts may confuse investors. Like the distinction between 0 and 1, the distinction between 1 and many can also clog our cookie cutter. For example, if you have exactly one PO class, can you still say that other than any PO classes, or do you have to say other than the PO class? I will argue that other than any PO classes works fine, whether it's 0, 1, or many, but again, some lawyers balk. Why? Lots of agreements have provision to the effect that the definition in section 1 shall apply equally to both the singular and the plural forms of the terms defined. Nor is anyone likely to be shocked to find a provision that whenever the context may require, any pronoun shall include the corresponding masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. Similarly, nor is anyone likely to be shocked to find a provision that, okay, wherever the context may require pronoun change. Okay. Similarly, these agreements may provide that the plural shall include the singular. With the prospectus, few find it unacceptable that the back part, which in our district is called the core perspective, includes lots of information that is not needed for the current transaction. Are investors not expected to read the core perspective? After all, it's a single perspective in two parts, the core and the front part, which almost everyone refers to as the prospectus supplement. And it may be impossible in practice to read only those parts of the core perspectives that are relevant to a particular series. If the investors may be confused, argument were taken. If the investor may be confused, argument were taken seriously, there couldn't be self-registration. There couldn't be self-registration statements, at least not for complicated securities like residential mortgage pass-throughs. Such a conclusion would protect the investor by denying him assumed inclusion of the corresponding feminine or neuter, the more effective procedures that self-registration provides. Not a famous victory. We wouldn't be denying investors an efficient procedure if we argued that material that was irrelevant to this series would be tolerated in the core prospectus, but not in the supplement. But I can't see why an argument about investor disclosure should depend on the fuzzy line between the core and the supplement. Now, for what I hope will be useful tips in the construction of cookie cutters. First, if you're going to use the modular approach, it's nice to know where the appropriate modules can be found. In our residential mortgage securitizations, we have electronic versions of our prior deals, but no obvious way to find particular bits. So at some point, I constructed my own table in a reference document separate from any of the deal documents, and on a going forward basis, gave brief descriptions for the unique features of each deal. Some sample rows are shown in the table in Exhibit 11.1. So the underwriter was HSBC, rating Fitch and Moody's, number of pools 2, LIBOR, yes. I don't know what NAS means. Proportion of scheduled shift, percent of unscheduled, insured year maintenance agreement, RUMIC's final deck table page, and other. I constructed my own table in a reference document separate from any of the deal documents, and on a going forward basis gave brief descriptions of the unique features of each deal. Some samples are shown. Exhibit 11.1. This isn't a course in mortgage securitization, so I am not going to explain just what all the hieroglyphs mean. Suffice to say that If my next deal involves two pools, that is groups of mortgage loans, fourth column from the left, I can find a recent deal that also had two pools, which means that I can find tables already laid out for two pools rather than one or three pools. For example, if your deal has two pools, then there are likely to be tables laid out with a column for various features, such columns for each of the two pools, and then a column for the two pools combined, four columns in all. It's a bit of work to convert a 3 or 5 column table to a 4 column format. So, and get it to look right. So it's nice to have tables with the right numbers of columns already on hand. As the preceding example shows, we are not talking here about saving days or even hours of work. In the fever that surrounds a mortgage securitization, we are looking to save minutes. Every place we can. Perhaps I should explain. Mortgage securitization involves taking the principal and interest payments of pool of mortgage and using them to fund classes of securities with payment terms that will appeal to investors. For a simple example, one class of securities may pay interest of 6% per annum and another class 6.5% per annum. All these other things being equal, the latter class of securities will have a higher price tag, but that's just the simple stuff. We can also have a security that pays 6% outside the baseball season, 8% during the baseball season for calendar months in which the Yankees have a losing record, and 4% in the months where the box boomers are not so fortunate. I've never seen such a security, but I suspect there's an untapped market of Steinbrenner hating investors who will be happy to pony up the cash. It would be easy enough to construct such a class of securities. One would just have to mirror it with a class that pays more when the Yankees lose and less when they win. The important point for my example is not whether there have ever been such securities, but that you can structure all kinds of outlandish features if you can find investors. In my example, Steinbrenner haters or lovers who want them. So in the real world, the underwriters who structure the issuance, that is, determine the particular properties of classes, are trying to match features to investors. This goes on right up to the last minute. It has become common for the main features of the structure to be determined only days before closing, often on the day before you have to deliver a nearly completed draft prospectus and pooling agreement to the rating agencies. In this kind of frenzied atmosphere, seconds count and minutes how. It's actually worse than that. The mortgage securitization business requires that deals close at the end of the month. So when I have two deals in a month, as I usually do these days, they usually close on consecutive days. So all the work for two deals is crammed into the same few days at month's end to be rammed through by me and the world's best and fastest paralegal. My standard grim pleasantry is to say that I have the easiest job in the world. I only work 2 days a month. It's crazy frantic, but if you can do it, you can save a mountain of legal fees. And if anyone can do it, the economic logic means that sooner or later, it'll be your turn. It's crazy frantic, but if you can do it, you save a mountain of legal fees. And if anyone can do it, the economic logic means that sooner or later, it'll be your turn. Back to tables. My prospectus have a number of big tables that contain many rows. For example, there's one that shows how many of the mortgages in a pool. For example, there is one that shows how many of the mortgages in the pool and in the combined pool are in various states and the District of Columbia. Such a table always has at least 30 rows and sometimes as many as 40. In such a table, there is no alternative to having columns. In such a table, there is no alternative to having columns for the pool designations and rows for the state designations. That is, tables with 4 to 6 columns and 30 to 40 rows rather than 4 to 6 rows and 30 to 40 columns. But in many tables, there may be only 1 or 2 features for each pool. For example, a table showing how many loans in each pool have been originated by banks and mortgage brokers not affiliated with the issuer could be either 2 rows and 4 to 6 columns, or 2 columns and 4 to 6 rows. And here you want to go with the 2 column, 4 to 6 row tables. That is this. Why? Because if you sometimes have two pools, sometimes, okay, you want to, and here you want to go with the 2-column 46-row table. Okay, why? Because if you sometimes have two pools, sometimes one or three or more, it's a lot easier to simply add or delete rows to the first table than to add or delete columns from the second. It's even easier than running to your reference table of series features to find the appropriately sized table. And the final word on tables, to the greatest extent possible, put all numerical data in tables. Why? Because tables are easy to see. What I'm going to say next is going to sound like major heresy. So I suggest that lawyers of the old school should read this sitting down with, I don't know what this is, digitalis handy. A lot of the time, saving on cooking quarters involves saving time on reading as well as writing. The standard pattern is that every document, and especially documents that are going to investors and being filed with the SEC, have got to be carefully reviewed. The problem in the real world is that there often isn't time for such careful fly speak. So what you want to do is to construct the documents so that they can be read quickly, but never have any mistakes. Well, hardly ever. And the best way to accomplish this is to put all the variable parts of the document, the parts that change from deal to deal, where they can most easily be found. Tables accomplish this fairly easy. Of course, there's lots of variable data that does not lend itself to tabular presentation. In such cases, the variable data should be close to the beginning of the section as possible. For example, the discussion of the Ezra, ERISA, section of our perspectives supplements runs 9 paragraphs. There's a longer discussion in the core, but all the variable material is in the first sentence of the first paragraph. The first sentence gets read and the rest gets skimmed. Employee retirement. Is that Ezra? I think it's about employee retirement. Anyway, okay. And so that is the chapter on modern times on the assembly line about how to use cookie cutter documents to speed up your legal process. So we read pages 207 to page 221. We read 14 pages. All right, look for the next chapter.